The room smells of leather and fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a man who has just realized he is about to die. That kind of fear has its own clean, electric scent like a wire strip bare. This is older. This is the fear of a man who has spent 30 years constructing himself from nothing, brick by imaginary brick, and who now, in a humid Moscow summer of 1953, feels the entire structure beginning to tremble beneath him. His name, or the name the world knows him by, is Lavrentiy Beria. He sits in a leather chair in a fortified bunker beneath the headquarters of the Moscow military district. His pince-nez sitting precisely on the bridge of his nose, his hands resting in his lap, with the practiced stillness of a man who once commanded the lives of millions. The chair is heavy and dark. The room is windowless. Outside, the June heat presses against the concrete walls of the city like a hand pressed against a closed door. He has been here since the evening of the 26th of June. 24 hours ago, he was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. The head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, a first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, the architect of the atomic program, the shadow behind every significant decision made in the Kremlin since 1938. 24 hours ago, marshals and ministers flinched when he entered a room. Now, there's a guard at the door who does not flinch at anything. The guard is young. He looks at the man in the leather chair the way you look at something that has already been decided. The door opens, and a man enters who is not a guard and not a prosecutor and not a party official in the traditional sense. He carries no folder. He wears civilian clothing of indeterminate origin. He sits across from a man in the leather chair without being invited to do so, and this small act of disrespect, this tiny, deliberate erasure of protocol, lands in the room like a stone dropped into still water. For a long moment, neither speaks. Then the man asks a question. He does not ask about the signed execution orders. He does not ask about the files on foreign intelligence contacts, or the alleged conspiracy to seize power, or the long list of charges that Soviet newspapers will soon publish in their careful, bureaucratic language. He asks none of these things. He leans forward slightly and asks, in a voice so quiet it is almost intimate, "Who were you? Really? Where did you come from? What is the blood that runs in you?" And for the first time in 30 years, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, Lavrentiy Beria has no answer prepared. This is the moment we must understand. Not December, when the sentence is carried out. Not the trial and its 6 days of sealed proceedings before a special session of the Supreme Court, where there is no defense counsel and no right of appeal. Not the newspaper announcement that follows, with its careful language about anti-party and anti-state activities. The moment that matters is this one, a man stripped of power, sitting in a room that smells of leather and concrete, confronted not with what he did, but with who he is. Because here is what history has always misunderstood about Lavrentiy Beria. The crimes are documented. The orders are on paper, or on paper before certain papers disappeared. The terror he administered is a matter of record, etched into the bones of hundreds of thousands of families across the Soviet Empire. That part of the story, however monstrous, is in some sense knowable. Prosecutors know how to prosecute crimes. Archives know how to preserve evidence of wrongdoing. History knows how to condemn. What history does not know, what it has never been allowed to fully know, is something far more fundamental, something that precedes the crimes, precedes the power, precedes the pince-nez and the leather chair and the signed orders and the bunker. Something that was set in motion in a small village near Sukhumi, in the borderlands between two cultures, two languages, two peoples who have been arguing about the same hills for centuries. Merkheuli. The name sits quietly in the historical record like a stone in a stream. A village in what is today Abkhazia, that contested, complicated territory that even geography cannot quite decide how to classify. Georgian or Abkhazian, mountain or coast, ancient or modern. The village sits near Sukhumi, close enough to smell the Black Sea on certain days when the wind comes from the right direction. It is a place of borderlines. It is a place where identity is not a fixed thing, where a man's name in one language has a different weight than the same sound in another, where what you call yourself in the morning may not be what your grandmother called you at night. This is where the official story begins. And this is where, if you look carefully enough, the official story begins to come apart. The Soviet state said Beria was born on the 29th of March of 1899. Some sources say it was 1898, and the discrepancy itself is a small but telling wound in the narrative. It said he was Georgian. It said his father was a peasant named Pavel, and that the family was of Mingrelian heritage, that particular subgroup of Georgian identity that has its own language, its own customs, its own complicated relationship with a broader Georgian cultural world. It said he attended school, joined revolutionary circles, rose through the intelligence apparatus with the natural momentum of a talented young man in a revolutionary era. This is a clean story. It has the shape and texture of truth. It reads the way official biographies are supposed to read, a straight line from unremarkable origins to remarkable achievement, interrupted by nothing more complicated than history itself. But there is a problem with clean stories about complicated places. The problem is that clean stories about complicated places are almost always constructed. They're almost always the product, not of a life actually lived in a certain way, but of a life that someone, a person, or a system, or the collaboration between a person and a system, decided needed to look as though it was lived in a certain way. The clean story is not a record. It is a performance. And like all performances, if you watch it long enough from the right angle and the right light, you begin to see the effort behind it. You begin to see the seams. The man sitting in the fortified bunker on the 27th of June, 1953, has been performing for decades. He has performed loyalty and performed ideology and performed Georgian identity and performed socialist conviction and performed paternal warmth and performed bureaucratic detachment, and performed, above all, the particular quality that Stalin valued above all others in his subordinates, the quality of being entirely legible, entirely explicable, entirely reducible to the role assigned to you by the system. He has performed so well for so long that somewhere in the machinery of his performance, the original signal was lost. Even those who knew him most closely, the marshals, the ministers, the fellow members of the Politburo who plotted his downfall, the men who organized the June coup with the crucial assistance of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Even they could not say with certainty where the performance ended and the person began. Or perhaps they could. Perhaps this is precisely why the question asked in the fortified bunker, that quiet, almost tender question about blood and origin, landed with such force. Perhaps the men who brought Beria down knew, or suspected, that beneath the performance was not a person at all, but another performance. That the Georgian communist was a costume worn over a different costume. That the loyal Stalinist was a mask hiding not a disloyal Stalinist, but something far stranger, a man who had no original face. Consider what we are actually asking when we ask who a person is. We are asking about continuity. We are asking, is there a thread that runs from the child in the village near Sukhumi to the man in the leather chair in the Moscow bunker? Is there a consistent self that persisted through the decades of transformation, that chose its allegiances and carried its wounds and shaped its cruelties according to some inner logic that we can trace if we look hard enough? For most historical figures, even the most terrible ones, the answer is yes. The thread exists. It may be damaged or corrupted or wounded through terrible acts, but it is there. You can follow it backwards from the end to the beginning and find, at the origin point, something recognizable as a human life. With Beria, when you try to follow the thread backwards, it disappears. Not phrase, disappears. Somewhere between the man in the bunker and the child in the Caucasian borderlands, the record goes dark. Documents that should exist do not exist. Witnesses who should remember do not remember or are not available to be asked. Archives that should contain the ordinary residue of an ordinary early life, school records, church entries, family registrations, the bureaucratic sediment that any life deposits as it moves through time, are empty. The silence is not the silence of neglect. It is the silence of intention. And that silence is where this investigation begins. There is a principle in archival science, rarely discussed outside specialist circles, but understood instinctively by anyone who has spent time in the stacks of national libraries, in the back rooms of regional document collections, in the digital catalogs that post-Soviet republics have been slowly, unevenly assembling since the 1990s. The principle is this: absence is itself a form of evidence. When a document does not exist where it should, when a record has been removed from a shelf where the dust still holds the shape of what was once there, that negative space speaks. It speaks quietly, but it speaks with authority. The official biography of Lavrentiy Beria is, by the standards of a man who rose to the absolute summit of Soviet power, remarkably thin in its early sections. He is said to have been born in the spring of 1899 in the village of Merkheuli, near Sukhumi, in the region of Abkhazia, then administered as part of the broader Kutaisi Governorate of the Russian Empire. His father is named as Pavel Kukevich Beria, a peasant. His mother as Marta Jackali, described as deeply religious, Georgian Orthodox, a woman who spent decades of her long life in prayer. The family is identified as Mingrelian, a subgroup of the Georgian ethno-linguistic world that has its own distinct language and its own complicated historical identity. This is what we are told. Now, let us examine what we can actually confirm. The birth year itself is contested. Most Soviet-era sources give 1899. Some Western sources, working from different documents, cite 1898. A discrepancy of 1 year in a man's birth date might seem trivial. A clerical error, a conversion error between the Julian and Gregorian calendars, the kind of minor inconsistency that appears in any archival record from the Caucasus of that era. But this particular discrepancy matters because it appears at the very foundation of the official story. If the foundational date cannot be agreed upon, what does that tell us about the reliability of everything built upon it? He is recorded as having attended a technical school in Sukhumi. He is recorded as having enrolled in the Baku Polytechnicum, the institution later known as the Azerbaijan State Oil Academy, sometime around 1915 or 1916. He claimed to have joined the Bolshevik faction in March of 1917 while a student in Baku. These facts appear in the official biography, in various encyclopedias, in the controlled Soviet historical record. They are presented as established. They have the confident texture of things that have been repeated often enough to feel true. But here is what the honest researcher finds when they try to move beyond the official account and into the primary sources. The school records from Sukhumi for that period are incomplete. The enrollment registers of the Baku Polytechnicum were not consistently maintained during the revolutionary years of 1917 through 1920. The Bolshevik Party membership records from the Caucasus in this period are fragmentary, reorganized multiple times, and in many cases simply do not survive. And so we arrive at the peculiar fact at the heart of this investigation. The first truly reliable, independently verifiable document in the entire paper trail of Lavrentiy Beria is not a birth certificate. It is not a school record. It is not a party membership card from 1917. It is a document from the intelligence apparatus, a record showing him as deputy head of the secret operational department of the Azerbaijan Chayka in April of 1921. By 1922, he is deputy chairman of the Georgian Chayka, the organization that has just helped consolidate Bolshevik control over the Caucasus. Think about what this means. The first solid trace of his existence in the documentary record places him already inside the secret police structure, already a deputy chairman, already a man of consequence. Everything before that, the childhood, the school years, the student politics in Baku, the alleged revolutionary activities during the Civil War, exists only in sources that either derive from Beria's own account of himself or from Soviet institutional biographies written years or decades after the fact. In his own autobiography, written in October of 1923, Beria provides a compact narrative of his early years. It is the account of a man describing his past to an institution that does not yet know him well, constructing on paper the person he needs to be. The language is careful. The chronology is selective. There are gaps, particularly around the years 1918 through 1920, that the autobiography acknowledges only in the vaguest terms. He mentions working in the secretariat of the Baku Council. He mentions being arrested in Georgia. He mentions underground work. But the connective tissue is missing. The autobiography reads less like a memoir and more like a file designed to satisfy a specific bureaucratic requirement. What happened during those years between 1918 and 1921? What was a young man from a village near Sukhumi actually doing as the Russian Empire collapsed, as the Caucasus became a theater of competing national movements and foreign interventions and Bolshevik ambitions? The official account is fragmentary and contradictory. And there is something else, something that the official account mentions almost in passing, but which, when examined carefully, opens into a much larger question. In 1919, Beria took a position with the intelligence service of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, the anti-Bolshevik Muscovitist government. He was, in other words, working for the political enemy of the Bolshevik cause he claimed to have joined in 1917. When the Bolsheviks took Baku in April of 1920 and his anti-Bolshevik employment came to light, he was reportedly saved from execution, by some accounts because there was simply not enough time to process his case, by other accounts because of the intervention of Sergei Kirov, one of the most powerful Bolshevik figures in the Caucasus. A young man who worked for the anti-Bolshevik intelligence services was captured by Bolsheviks, escaped execution through bureaucratic accident or high-level patronage, and then, within months, found himself employed by the Bolshevik secret police and rising rapidly through its ranks. This is not an unusual story for the chaotic years of the Russian Civil War, when allegiances shifted and survival required flexibility. But it is an unusual foundation for a man who would go on to become the most powerful secret police chief in Soviet history, the guardian of ideological purity, the man responsible for screening the loyalty of everyone else. Unless, of course, the story is more complicated than it appears. Unless what looks like opportunistic flexibility was actually something more deliberate. Unless the young man who passed through the intelligence services of multiple Caucasian factions in the years between 1918 and 1921 was not simply surviving, but was being shaped or was shaping himself into something very specific. Consider the geography. Baku sits on the Caspian coast of what is today Azerbaijan, a city that in the late imperial and early revolutionary period was one of the most cosmopolitan and politically complex places in the entire former Russian Empire. It was a city of oil wealth and ethnic layering, where Azerbaijanis and Armenians and Russians and Persians and Germans and a dozen other nationalities lived in proximity that was sometimes creative and sometimes explosive. It was a city where a young man of uncertain origins could, if he possessed the right qualities, intelligence, adaptability, and ability to present himself differently to different interlocutors, move between worlds in ways that would have been impossible in a more ethnically homogeneous environment. It was also, crucially, a city where the intelligence services of multiple powers were active. British military intelligence, operating through the intervention force in the Caucasus. Azerbaijani counterintelligence, the organization that hired Beria in 1919. German military intelligence, with which Beria reportedly had indirect contact through a woman named Zinaida Kremsa, who had connections to German networks. And, of course, the nascent Bolshevik intelligence apparatus, which was already recruiting agents across the region. A young man moving through all of these environments, serving some of them and perhaps observing others, learning the craft of intelligence not from a manual, but from lived practice in one of the most contested intelligence theaters of the early 20th century. This is a different person from the peasant son who attended technical school in Sukhumi and joined the Bolsheviks out of ideological conviction. This is a person who was being formed by a specific set of experiences that had almost nothing to do with the official biography. And here we arrive at the deepest paradox of the documentary record. The years that the official biography covers most sparsely, 1918 through 1921, are precisely the years that would be most revealing about who Beria actually was, what he actually believed, and where his actual loyalties lay. These are the years that were, in all likelihood, deliberately obscured, not because nothing happened during them, but because too much happened, and what happened did not fit the clean story of the Georgian peasant son who became a loyal Bolshevik. The silence of the archives is not emptiness. It is a locked room, and behind the locked room, the investigation is only beginning. Language does not lie. This is the first principle of anyone who has ever tried to understand a person more deeply than that person wishes to be understood. You can forge a document. You can rehearse a story until it flows without hesitation. You can dress in the clothing of another culture, eat its food, observe its rituals, perform its gestures with a fluency that comes from years of careful imitation. But language, spoken language, the language that emerges under pressure, in anger, in surprise, in the unguarded moment between sleep and waking. Language carries what the body has always known. It carries the shape of childhood. It carries the sound of the first voice that ever spoke to you. The people who knew Lavrentiy Beria professionally, the apparatchiks and generals and party functionaries who attended the same meetings, shared the same conference tables, sat across from him during the long Kremlin dinners that Stalin used as instruments of psychological control. These people noted something about his Georgian that was difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to ignore. It was correct. It was fluent. It contained no obvious errors of grammar or vocabulary, but it had a quality that native speakers of any language recognize instantly, even if they struggle to name it, the quality of a language learned rather than absorbed. The quality of a second tongue that has been trained to sound like a first tongue, but has never quite completed the transformation. One former Georgian party official, whose memoirs circulated in samizdat form in the 1970s, described Beria's Georgian as sounding like a man who had studied the language from a very good teacher, precise, educated, careful, but who had not grown up dreaming in it. There was, he wrote, a certain hesitation at the edges of idioms, a slight recalibration before certain phrases, as though the speaker were crossing from one internal register to another, and the crossing, while practiced, was still a crossing. In Russian, Beria was reportedly more fluid, more natural, more quick to reach for the exact word without visible calculation. This in itself is not decisive. Many people are more comfortable in their second language than their first, particularly when the second language has been the medium of professional life for decades. But combined with everything else, combined with the missing documents and the contradictory birth year and the 4 silent years in the Caucasian intelligence underworld, it becomes one more thread pulled loose from the fabric of the official story. His name is the next thread. Lavrentiy. It is a name of Latin origin, derived from the Roman cognomen Laurentius, associated with the Christian martyr Saint Lawrence. It entered the Slavic world through the Orthodox Church calendar, where it appears as a saint's day name, a name given at baptism in honor of a particular saint, on or near the date of that saint's feast. It is not a Georgian name. It is not a Mingrelian name. It is not a name from the Caucasian cultural world in any of its forms. It is a name that a Georgian family might theoretically give a child if they were deeply integrated into the Russian Orthodox administrative and cultural sphere, but it is unusual. It is the kind of name that would stand out in a village community where children were typically given Georgian saints' names. Georgy, Nikolaos, David, Tamara. Pavlovich. The patronymic, the middle name derived from the father's first name, tells us that his father was named Pavel. Pavel is again a Slavic rendering of the apostolic name Paul. In Georgian, the equivalent would be Pavel, a name that does exist in the Georgian Christian tradition, but in the Slavic administrative form Pavel, it carries a different cultural signature. It is the name of a man who existed in Russian-language administrative documents, whose identity was recorded not in the Georgian script and Georgian naming conventions of his supposed community, but in the Imperial Russian bureaucratic register. The surname Beria deserves separate attention. Georgian surnames follow recognizable patterns. Endings like Ads, Eli, Yanni, Yuri, Ava are characteristic of different regional and ethnic traditions within the broader Georgian world. The surname Beria does not fit any of these patterns cleanly. It has been analyzed by various scholars of Caucasian linguistics over the decades, and the conclusions are remarkably consistent. The name is more easily located in Abkhazian or Mingrelian phonetic traditions than in mainstream Georgian naming conventions. Searches of Georgian church records, the birth registers, baptismal rolls, parish documentation that the Orthodox Church maintained with varying degrees of consistency through the imperial period turn up the surname with extreme rarity. It is not a name that has deep roots in the Georgian documentary tradition. It is a name that arrives in the record, essentially with the man who bears it. There's more. Look at the photographs, not the official portraits. Those are carefully composed, carefully lit products of Soviet photographic ideology that transformed every face into an icon of the appropriate type. Look at the candid images, the group photographs from party conferences, the snapshots that survived because they were too obscure to bother suppressing. In these images, Beria's physical appearance presents a set of characteristics that Georgian ethnographers and anthropologists of the period would not have classified as typically Kartvelian Georgian. The facial structure, the prominent cheekbones, the particular set of the eyes, the shape of the jaw, aligns more naturally with the Abkhazian physical type, or with the various Circassian and Northwest Caucasian peoples whose territories border the region where he was supposedly born. Physical appearance is, of course, the most treacherous kind of evidence. The Caucasus is among the most ethnically complex regions on Earth, a place where centuries of migration, conquest, intermarriage, and cultural overlap have produced populations that defy easy phenotypic classification. A man can look Abkhazian and be thoroughly Georgian, just as a man can speak Georgian with an accent and have been born speaking nothing else. Appearance alone proves nothing, but appearance combined with language, combined with naming conventions, combined with the documentary silence and the biographical gaps, combined with what local memory preserved about his family, all of this together begins to assemble a different picture than the one painted by the official biography. In Abkhazia, in the communities near Sukhumi and the surrounding villages, there circulated for generations a folk memory about Beria that Soviet historiography naturally never recorded or preserved. Older residents described his mother not as the Georgian Orthodox peasant woman of the official account, but as a woman who spoke Abkhazian in her home, who wore Abkhazian dress on certain occasions, who maintained connections with Abkhazian families in the area. His father, the official Pavel, the peasant, appears in local memory as a more shadowy figure, less present, less defined. In some accounts, he is barely present at all. The family, in the memory of those who claimed proximity to it, was a borderland family in the fullest sense. Not fully one thing, not fully another, existing in the interstitial space between Georgian cultural dominance and Abkhazian cultural persistence that characterized so much of the social reality of Western Abkhazia in the late imperial period. if this local memory carries any weight. And local memory in closed, hierarchical societies often preserves what official documentation erases, precisely because it circulates below the level where the state thinks to intervene. Then the picture that emerges is of a boy who grew up understanding himself to be something other than what his eventual official biography would claim. A boy who understood, from an early age, that identity in his particular corner of the Caucasus was not a natural fact, but a political choice. That what you called yourself, and what language you chose to speak in public, and what cultural affiliations you performed in the presence of those with power over you. These were decisions, not inheritances. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the man who would become the head of the NKVD, the administrator of the Gulag, the second most feared figure in the Soviet Union. He understood something about identity that most people never have reason to learn, that it is constructed, that it is performed, that the self you present to the world is not a reflection of some essential inner truth, but a choice made under specific conditions for specific purposes. He had learned this not from a philosophy book or a political treatise, but from a most visceral possible teacher, from the experience of growing up in a place where your name, your language, and your ancestry could determine your safety, your opportunity, and your survival. A child who learns that identity is a mask does not grow up to be a person who trusts any face they see. A child who learns that truth is negotiable does not grow up to be a person who feels bound by truth. A child who learns that the most powerful tool available to a person of uncertain origins is the ability to become, convincingly, whoever the situation requires. This child does not grow up to be an ordinary man. He grows up to be exactly the kind of man who can sit in a room, in leather and concrete, stripped of all power, and still, even now, even here, resist the question about blood and origin with the practiced stillness of a man who has spent his entire life making sure that question can never be properly answered. Every empire has its borderlands, and in every borderland, there lives a particular kind of person that empires create without intending to, a person formed by the pressure between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, fluent in the languages of both, and quietly, permanently furious about the condition of existing between. History is full of these people. They rise in disproportionate numbers to positions of power within the very empires that produced their ambiguity. Because the empire needs people who can navigate its edges, who can speak to its margins, who understand from the inside what it means to be neither center nor periphery, but the living membrane between them. And then, when these people reach the summit, the empire is often surprised to discover that the membrane has its own agenda. Abkhazia in the late 19th and early 20th century was exactly this kind of borderland. It was a place that the Russian Empire had conquered by force in the 1860s, depopulating vast sections of its indigenous Abkhazian population through war, expulsion, and a mass migration known as the Mahajarism, a catastrophe in which somewhere between half and two-thirds of the entire Abkhazian people fled or were driven to the Ottoman Empire, leaving their ancestral lands empty for resettlement by Georgian, Armenian, Russian, and Greek colonists. Those Abkhazians who remained lived as a diminished minority in a land that had been theirs for centuries, governed by Russian imperial administration, surrounded by incoming settlers, their language officially marginal, their cultural institutions weakened, their traditional leadership structures dismantled. Into this landscape, in the borderland village of Merkheuli, in the final years of the 19th century, a child was born. What the official biography calls his Georgian identity, what the Soviet state certified and sealed and presented to the world as established fact, may have been, if the alternative evidence is taken seriously, a layer of identity placed over an older, more complicated, more politically dangerous truth. The truth of an Abkhazian family, or a family of mixed Abkhazian and Mingrelian heritage, living in the shadow of Georgian cultural and demographic expansion, performing Georgian identity as a survival strategy in the way that minorities throughout history have performed the identity of the dominant culture when the alternative is marginalization or worse. The hypothesis is not exotic. It is, in fact, the ordinary logic of minority survival in conditions of cultural dominance. You learn the dominant language better than its native speakers. You adopt the dominant culture's names and customs and religious practices. You send your children to the dominant culture's schools. You do all of this not because you have ceased to know who you are, but precisely because you know who you are, and you know that being openly what you are carries a cost that you have decided not to pay. The performance of the dominant identity is not a betrayal of the original one. It is a strategy for preserving what cannot be openly preserved. If the young Lavrentiy Beria was this kind of person, and the accumulation of linguistic, documentary, and ethnographic evidence suggests strongly that he may have been, then his subsequent career takes on a different shape entirely. Consider the specific patterns of his behavior as Georgian Communist Party secretary between 1931 and 1938, the years when he established himself as Stalin's most reliable instrument in the Caucasus. During this period, Beria oversaw a systematic campaign against the Georgian cultural and intellectual elite. Writers, scholars, historians, linguists, the custodians of Georgian national memory. Georgian academics who had spent their careers documenting Georgian history and Georgian cultural heritage were arrested in disproportionate numbers. Georgian language institutions were brought under tighter political control. The Georgian intelligentsia, as a class, was decimated. The Soviet explanation for this, the official explanation, the ideological explanation, is that Beria was purging bourgeois nationalist elements, implementing the standard Stalinist policy of subordinating national cultures to socialist internationalism. This explanation is not false. The purges were happening everywhere, and their ideological justification was consistent across the entire Soviet Union. But it does not fully account for the particular intensity that contemporaries noted in Beria's approach to Georgian cultural targets specifically. There was a quality to his pursuit of the Georgian intelligentsia that went beyond bureaucratic compliance with Moscow's directives. There was something that looked, to those who observed it closely, like personal investment. A man who is simply executing orders does not need to be thorough in the specific way that Beria was thorough. He does not need to pursue the archives as well as the people. He does not need to be present, personally, at certain interrogations that a man of his rank would normally delegate entirely. He does not need to take the particular interest he took in the fates of Georgian historians who were working on questions of ethnic origins in the Caucasus. Scholars whose research, if completed and published, might have illuminated precisely the questions about the borderland ethnic history of Western Abkhazia that the official biography of Beria most needed to remain obscure. This is speculative. Let that be stated clearly in the spirit of honest investigation. The connection between Beria's possible Abkhazian origins and his campaign against the Georgian intelligentsia cannot be proven from surviving documents. The documents that might have proven it or disproven it are among those that did not survive the archive clearances of 1953 and after. But the hypothesis has the quality that distinguishes useful speculation from empty speculation. It explains things that otherwise require more complicated explanations. It takes behavior that appears, under the official account, as ideological excess and reveals a possible logic beneath the excess. It answers the question of why in a way that the purely ideological explanation does not. There is a phrase that elderly Abkhazian residents reportedly used when speaking of Beria in the years before such speech became entirely impossible. In the brief windows of relative openness in the 1920s, and again the fragmented testimonies that emerged in the post-Soviet period from the very old who still carried family memories of the era. The phrase translates roughly as the one who came back wearing someone else's face. It is not a term of condemnation. In Abkhazian folk memory, as reported by ethnographers working in the region after Soviet dissolution, there is a certain understanding, even a certain dark admiration, for the person who masters the art of survival through identity transformation. The Caucasus has produced many such people across many centuries. The mountains teach a particular kind of practical philosophy about the relationship between truth and survival. What the phrase implies is not that Beria was a traitor to Abkhazian identity. It implies something more nuanced, that he was a person who took the Abkhazian experience of living under Georgian cultural dominance and converted it into a tool of extraordinary power. That the very condition of double consciousness, of knowing yourself to be one thing while performing another, which had been forced upon his people by historical circumstance, became in his hands not a burden, but a weapon. The most effective weapon available to a person in the Soviet system, which was above all a system that rewarded the ability to perform loyalty while pursuing interest. His wife, Nino Gejikori, was Georgian, from a well-established Georgian family with roots in the Imereti region. The marriage has been interpreted as a straightforward personal choice, or as a strategic alliance, or as a form of social assimilation. It may have been all three simultaneously. But consider what the marriage also accomplished, independent of intention. It inserted Beria permanently and visibly into the Georgian social fabric. It gave him in-laws, family connections, the organic social web that a man without deep roots needs if he is to perform rootedness convincingly. Nino's family gave him Georgian authenticity in the social register that documents cannot fully provide. The register of family dinners and shared histories and a knowledge that flows between people who have known each other across generations. She was, by all accounts of those who knew her in later years, a woman who understood her husband imperfectly at best. She knew the man she had married. She may not have fully known who that man had been before he became the man she married. In the silence she maintained after his arrest and execution, the decades of quiet, careful, dangerous silence, raising their son Sergo while carrying whatever she knew and had chosen not to say, there is a story of its own that history has not yet found the language to tell. What she knew about his origins, she took with her. What Sergo knew, or suspected, or had been told in fragments across the years of his father's power and the long aftermath of his fall, he mostly kept to himself through a lifetime of careful public obscurity. The son of a man who constructed himself from silence learned, perhaps inevitably, how to be silent in return. But silence is not nothing. Silence, as this investigation has already established, is its own form of testimony. In the silence that surrounds the question of Beria's true origins, the silence of his wife, the silence of his son, the silence of the archives, the silence of the borderland communities where his family lived, the silence imposed by a system that needed him to be Georgian and could not afford to have anyone look too closely at whether he actually was, this silence has the shape of something hidden. It has the weight of truth that was never permitted to become record. There is a type of person that psychologists of the mid-20th century struggled to name precisely, because the clinical language available to them had been developed in conditions of relative social stability. And this type of person is not produced by stability. They are produced by rupture, by the experience of learning, at an age when the self is still forming, that the world is not what it presents itself to be, that the adults around you are performing safety rather than feeling it, that the identity you are given is a garment rather than a skin, that the most important truths in your immediate world are the ones that are never spoken aloud. The child who absorbs this lesson does not simply learn a fact about the world. The child is restructured by it. Something in the architecture of the developing self is rerouted, and the rerouting is permanent. The boy who grew up in Merkheuli in the first decade of the 20th century, whatever his actual blood, whatever the full truth of his family's origins and allegiances and private languages, grew up in a household that understood something about concealment. Whether the concealment was ethnic, political, or simply the ordinary concealment of poverty and marginality in a colonial borderland, the effect on a perceptive child would have been the same. He would have learned to read rooms before entering them. He would have learned to assess what version of himself was required by each new interlocutor. He would have developed, very early, the particular form of social intelligence that is really a survival skill in disguise. The ability to give people not the truth about yourself, but the version of yourself that makes them feel secure, that makes them feel they understand you, that makes them lower their guard. This is not a description of a monster. This is a description of a child in difficult circumstances developing the tools available to children in difficult circumstances. The monstrousness, if we're going to use that word, comes later, and it comes not from the original adaptation, but from what happens when a person formed by this kind of childhood is given gradually and then suddenly the power to impose on others what was once imposed on him. The child who is made to perform identity grows into the adult who forces others to perform loyalty. The boy who learned that truth is what the powerful decide becomes the man who decides what truth is for millions. People who worked closely with Beria across the long years of his power consistently noted a quality that they found difficult to describe without resorting to metaphor. He was, they said, different people in different rooms, not simply adaptable. Every competent official is adaptable, something more complete than that. With Stalin, he was deferential, almost filial, radiating a quality of devoted subordination that Stalin found deeply satisfying and that Beria maintained with extraordinary consistency across nearly 15 years. With his own subordinates in the NKVD apparatus, he was cold and technically precise, a manager of machinery who spoke the language of operations and results and showed no interest in the human texture of the people he managed. With the scientists of the atomic program, the physicists and engineers and mathematicians whom he supervised from 1945 onward with a mandate to produce a Soviet nuclear device, he was pragmatic, capable of genuine intellectual engagement, surprisingly willing to listen and defer to expertise. These are not simply different modes of the same person. They are, by multiple accounts, qualitatively different presences. People who encountered Beria in one context and then met him in another sometimes expressed genuine surprise, not at a change of tone or register, which would be unremarkable, but at the sensation of meeting, functionally, a different person. A person who did not seem to remember or care about the version of himself that had existed in the previous encounter. His son Sergo, in the carefully measured memoir he published decades after his father's death, described a domestic life of unusual emotional flatness. Not cruelty. Sergo was at pains to describe a father who was present, who took interest in his education, who expressed affection in the practical ways that men of his generation and class expressed affection. But beneath the performance of family life, and Sergo's choice of the word performance is telling, even if he did not consciously intend it as such, there was always the sensation of something withheld, of a man who was playing the role of father with the same fundamental remove with which he played every other role, as though the inner room, the room where the actual person lived, was never open, as though there was no inner room, or as though the inner room had been sealed so long ago, so thoroughly, that even its inhabitant had forgotten what it contained. This is the psychological signature of a specific developmental experience. The clinical literature on individuals who have spent formative years maintaining a false identity, whether for reasons of ethnic survival, as refugees and hidden minorities throughout history have done, or for political reasons, as agents and operatives have done, or for the more ordinary social reasons that closeted and concealed people have always had. This literature is consistent on one point. The maintenance of a performed identity is not cost-free. It extracts a specific psychological price, and the price is paid in the currency of authentic emotional connection. A person who has learned to perform the self has, by definition, learned to experience the self as performance. The gap between the performing self and whatever lies beneath it does not close over time. It widens. And as it widens, the capacity for genuine empathy, for the experience of another person's reality as having the same weight and validity as one's own, diminishes. Not because such a person is born without empathy. That is the crucial distinction, the one that matters most for understanding how systems produce the people who then operate them. Beria was not born a man without empathy. He was formed into one. The capacity was there at the beginning. It must have been because empathy is the raw material that social intelligence requires, and his social intelligence was extraordinary. What happened across the years of performance and concealment and survival was that the empathy was not destroyed but redirected. It became a tool rather than a feeling. He used it to read people, to understand what they needed, what they feared, what version of himself would produce the response he required. But the understanding remained external. It never completed the circuit back into felt connection. A man who understands your fear without feeling it is far more dangerous than a man who feels nothing. The man who feels nothing is limited by his blindness. The man who understands your fear with cold precision can use it with a sophistication that the purely unfeeling cannot achieve. During the years of the Great Terror, between 1936 and 1938, Beria signed documents authorizing the fates of human beings with a regularity that stuns the historical imagination. Not in the frenzy of a man overwhelmed by ideological passion, not with the evident relish of a sadist who derives pleasure from the act, but with the calm efficiency of an administrator processing correspondence. Colleagues who observed him during these years described someone who could move from an order of that kind to a discussion of technical specifications for a new building project or to a conversation about his son's school performance without any visible transition, without the moment of recalibration that most human beings require when shifting between emotional registers of such radical disparity. This is not the psychology of evil in the operatic sense that popular history prefers. It is something quieter and more disturbing. It is the psychology of a person for whom the categories that organize most human experience, the categories of self and other, of real and performed, of what matters and what is not, have been fundamentally reorganized by early experience into a configuration that serves survival and power rather than connection and meaning. The child who learned that identity is a mask grew into a man for whom the boundary between inside and outside had simply ceased to function in the ordinary way. In the system around him, the Soviet system with its demand for performed loyalty, its reward structure built entirely around the ability to give the leadership what it wanted to see rather than what was actually true, its deep structural preference for people who could operate without the friction of inconvenient conscience. This system did not create Beria's psychology, but it recognized it. It selected for it. It placed a person already formed by concealment into the position where concealment was the primary professional skill, and then watched as the fit between person and role became so perfect that, eventually, it was impossible to say where the role ended and the person began. If there was ever a moment when the inner room was still open, when the boy from the borderland, whatever his real name and real blood, was still present inside the man who had constructed himself over that boy like a series of ever more elaborate masks. That moment had passed long before the leather chair in the Moscow bunker. What sat in that chair in the summer of 1953 was the final product of a process that had begun in a Caucasian village at the turn of the century. A self assembled entirely from necessity, with nothing underneath it that could be threatened by a question about origins. Or almost nothing, because the man who sat entirely still when asked that question, who showed no visible reaction, whose hands did not move, and whose face did not change, that man was still sitting very still. And the stillness itself, that perfect, practiced, total stillness, was the last remaining signature of everything it was hiding. When a system decides to destroy a man, it faces a choice that is rarely discussed openly, but is always present. It can destroy the man and preserve the truth about him, or it can destroy the man and destroy the truth along with him. The first approach has the advantage of clarity. It produces a clean historical record, an account that future generations can examine and learn from, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end that makes sense. The second approach has a different kind of advantage, one that systems built on constructed reality understand intuitively. A man without a true story cannot become a true lesson. A man whose origins are buried cannot become an origin point for dangerous questions. You can condemn him for what he did. You cannot allow anyone to fully understand what he was. The Soviet system, in the summer and autumn of 1953, chose the second approach with Lavrentiy Beria, and it chose it with a thoroughness that itself constitutes evidence of what it was afraid to leave uncovered. The arrest on the 26th of June came with unusual procedural features that historians have noted but rarely examined with the attention they deserve. The men who organized it, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, with the critical physical support of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and a group of military officers, moved with a speed that precluded any possibility of Beria accessing or destroying his personal archive before custody was established. This was deliberate. They needed what was in that archive. They needed to know what Beria knew, what he had on each of them, what files he had accumulated across 15 years of running the apparatus that ran the Soviet Union's darkest machinery. The archive was not an afterthought. It was one of the primary objectives of the operation. What they found in that archive has never been fully disclosed. The official Soviet account of Beria's trial and the charges against him, espionage, treason, criminal abuse of power, was assembled from selected materials and presented to a special judicial session in December of 1953, before a court with no defense counsel, no public gallery, no independent observers, and no right of appeal. The proceedings lasted 6 days. The verdict was announced, the sentence carried out, and the archive was taken into the custody of the party leadership, where significant portions of it disappeared from the accessible historical record. Researchers who have worked with the partial declassifications of the subsequent decades have noted the peculiar incompleteness of what survives. There are gaps in the Beria archive that do not correspond to the pattern of ideologically motivated censorship, the kind of censorship that removes references to certain political events or certain names that remained sensitive in later Soviet periods. The gaps in Beria's personal archive are of a different character. They are gaps in the biographical record, in the personal correspondence, in the materials relating to his family background and early life. It is as though someone went through the archive not with an ideological criterion, but with a biographical one, removing not what was politically dangerous in the ordinary sense, but what was personally revealing in the deepest sense. Among the materials that former Soviet archivists and researchers have described as having existed in the archive before the post-arrest clearances, materials whose existence is attested by inventory references that survive even when the materials themselves do not. There are several categories that deserve particular attention. There were personal photographs from the early period of Beria's life, predating his entry into the secret police apparatus. There were letters, apparently from his mother, written in a language that the inventory describes with a word that translates roughly as not Russian and not Georgian, a description ambiguous enough to be consistent with Abkhazian or Mingrelian, the two languages that would be most significant given the hypothesis this investigation has been developing. There were documents relating to his early employment history in Baku, including materials that went beyond what appeared in his official autobiography of 1923. All of these categories are absent from what remains accessible. Their absence follows the precise contour of the questions that the official biography most needed to leave unanswered. Nino Gejikori, his wife, survived him by decades. She lived through the immediate aftermath of his arrest with extraordinary difficulty, arrested herself, held for an extended period, eventually released into a life of constrained obscurity in Moscow and later in Tbilisi, under surveillance, under pressure, under the constant awareness that the system which had destroyed her husband retained the power to destroy her and her son if it chose to. She gave very few interviews. She made very few public statements. She maintained, across the long years of her survival, a silence so complete and so consistent that it became, in itself, a kind of presence, a shaped silence, a silence with clear edges, the silence of a woman who had made a decision about what she would and would not say and had made that decision irrevocably. The son, Sergo, followed a similar path. He built a career as an engineer and a scientist, a deliberate retreat into the technical and the measurable, away from the political and the historical. He published his memoir late in life, when the Soviet Union had already dissolved and the danger of the old system had theoretically passed. The memoir is careful. It is honest within its chosen limits. It describes a father who was present and absent simultaneously, powerful and opaque, real and performed. But on the question of origins, on the question of what his father actually was, beneath the constructed identity, behind the Georgian surname and the Slavic given name and the official biography with its carefully selected facts, Sergo is as silent as his mother was. This silence is not cowardice. It would be a serious error to read it that way. It is the silence of people who understood something about the relationship between truth and survival that most people in stable societies never need to learn. It is the silence of a family that had watched the Soviet system destroy a man not for what he truly was, but for what it needed him to appear to be, first useful, then threatening, finally criminal, and that understood, with the intimate knowledge of direct experience, that the system's relationship to truth was always instrumental. Truth was a tool. The system used the truth about Beria's crimes when it needed to justify his destruction. It suppressed the truth about his origins because that truth complicated the narrative in ways the system could not control. The narrative the system needed was simple. Beria was a criminal, an aberration, a monster who had infiltrated the Soviet apparatus and corrupted it from within. By condemning him as an individual, by making him personally, singularly responsible for the terror he administered, the system absolved itself. It located the problem in a person rather than in a structure. It said, "We have removed the monster. The system that produced him is innocent. The system that produced him can continue." If the truth about Beria's origins had been allowed to surface, if it had become part of the public record that the man who ran Stalin's terror machine was himself a product of systematic identity construction, that his biography had been manufactured, that his Georgian credentials were performed rather than genuine, that the Soviet system had not simply employed a monster, but had actively created the conditions under which such a person could rise to absolute power, this truth would have raised questions that the system could not afford to answer. It would have asked, how many others? How many people in positions of power in the Soviet apparatus were operating under constructed identities, performing allegiances they did not feel, pursuing agendas that had nothing to do with the ideology they claimed to serve? How deep does the performance go? Is the system itself a performance? A construction of legitimacy built over an absence of legitimacy, in the same way that Beria's biography was a construction of identity built over an absence of identity? These are not rhetorical questions. They are analytical ones. And their analytical weight is precisely why the silence was maintained, why the archives were cleared, why the trial was closed, why the sentence was carried out with such haste that even the procedural requirements of Soviet law were not fully observed. The system buried Beria not just in the ground, but in constructed narrative, for the same reason it had once elevated him, because the truth was more dangerous than the lie. Because a system built on performed reality cannot survive the exposure of its own performance. Because the Soviet Union, at its deepest structural level, was exactly what Beria was at his deepest personal level, a vast, elaborately maintained construction of identity, built over an absence of the legitimacy it claimed, sustained by the willingness of enough people to perform belief in it long enough that the performance became, for practical purposes, indistinguishable from the thing it was performing. This is the final lesson of the man from the borderland. He was not an anomaly within the system. He was its purest expression, a person assembled from nothing, credentialed by a machine that credentialed everyone who served it, empowered to enforce a reality that had been decided in advance and defended against the intrusion of actual fact. He rose because the system recognized him. He fell because the system, once he had served his purpose, needed someone to blame for being what the system had made. The leather chair is empty now. The bunker has been repurposed, renovated, forgotten. The archive holds its shaped silences. The borderland village of Merkheuli still sits near the Black Sea coast, in a territory that the world cannot quite agree how to classify: Georgian or Abkhazian, occupied or independent, historical fact or political construction. The question asked in the bunker in the summer of 1953 was never officially answered. Who were you, really? Where did you come from? What's the blood that runs in you? The silence that answered it then answers it still. And the silence, as this investigation has argued from its first word to its last, is not emptiness. It is the most complete answer the system was capable of giving. It is the system's confession, offered in the only language that systems built on constructed truth ever speak.